And when the Drew Bledsoe gay question mark thing, that was a big controversial thing in the newspaper industry, and so that was and then at that time in '98 when this was going on, they had hired a sports editor uh, that was trying to run me out of Kansas City. His name was Rick Basic. He was hired by a guy named Den Man, who I had feuded with.
Oh,
And so this whole thing just got blown out of proportion. I was the newspaper, the Kansas City Star, and I ended up working there until 2010. But by that time, I had had so much success, that unanticipated success, when they hired me in 1994. I was a rocket ship launched to the moon, and I was a bigger deal than the paper. And anytime anybody at the Kansas City Star went anywhere, editor, publisher, managing editor, any of the everybody else, anytime they went anywhere in Kansas City and spoke, the first thing they're going to get asked is, "What's Jason Whitlock like?" Or "What Jason Whitlock this," and they just weren't comfortable with it. And I work for liberals, and at the time, I hadn't figured it out in my mind that because I did the first time I voted was just this past election cycle. I've
Really?
always tried to stay out of politics. And so I didn't have a political worldview, but I was clearly conservative by the positions and things that I would take. And I was really, really, I mean, extremely popular in Kansas City. And I'm working for a bunch of liberals that they had this black conservative guy that was driving all of this conversation and was bigger than anybody at the newspaper. And so this was their opportunity to cut me down to size. They had already again hired this Rick Basic with his specific job. The guy I'd have to go to lunch with the guy every Friday, and he'd sit in front of me every Friday and tell me that I suck. No one wants to read you anymore, blah, blah. I was just like, this is
Oh,
comical.
goodness.
And so they suspended me and, thought that would be the end of me. And I just kind of doubled down. I was like, oh, okay. I like it here in Kansas City. I'm dominant here. I can build an empire here and launch a national career from here while still working here because I believe you got to dominate locally to become some national person. And so that's what I did. And it drove them crazy for an additional 12 years before I left.
Jason, I was a columnist at my college newspaper, the Independent Florida.
Real quick, guys. I have a client I have to address. So I have to hop off. Pleasure meeting you, sir, and I'll be back if I can if I'm done with the client in time.
Perfect. Thank you. Nice to meet you, Alan.
See you, Alan.
Thank you, Alan.
Yeah, I would write these very controversial, very popular columns when I was in college. And then I went down to the same newspaper I'm already writing, these columns for. I walk into the sports department and, I try and get any gig that they would give me, covering women's golf, anything. They would not give me anything. They did not want me to get a foot in the door. They didn't want me to break into the industry that way. So I've experienced working with petty people in journalism. It's a whole little racket. But you were talking about dominating locally. I grew up in Miami. I was reading Dan Le Batard like every day. He used to be an incredible writer. That's what I wanted to do for a living. I wanted to do that, what Dan Le Batard was doing. Today, he's a pathetic communist. And I wanted to ask, it's doubly insane because his dad's a Cuban. He fled communist Cuba, and now Dan Le Batard's a communist, and he's a Cuban. So I wanted to ask you, can you tell me, tell us something about your experiences? I'm sure you've had run-ins with Dan Le Batard, the communist Cuban.
Andrew, you know nothing about me and Dan's history?
I could tell you that I'm sure I have seen it referenced before, but it's not written on my heart. I can't remember the feuds that you guys had.
Okay, and people will think that like I gassed you up or you're doing this to troll me or this is a setup. And so I just want to enter it into the record. I wasn't expecting this. You didn't, this wasn't planned. So Dan Le Batard for years was my best friend in the media industry.
Wow.
I know his parents. I knew his brother. Dan and I double dated on vacations. He'd take his girl to Vegas. I'd take whoever I was dating to Vegas. Dan and I were close. My best friend in the industry.
Wow.
And then as Deadspin and the culture started moving further and further left, Dan started seeking some distance from me because I wasn't going with the culture, and I just couldn't. It's just not in me. And so Dan's one of the best sports writers I've ever met, read, known. He used to do awesome work, but Dan, in my view, is a businessman first and foremost before anything. And so when the money started going left and survival in the business depended upon you being in line with the left, that's where he started to move. Now, I've seen a lot of people like when Deadspin was at the height of its power and influence, AJ Delario and Tommy Craggs and Tim Burke, these guys knew how to bully people. There was a price to pay for not getting on board with the leftist agenda in sports. And so when I saw Dan start going that direction, when I saw uh, uh, Dan's reaction to the smear campaigns that Deadspin was running on me, what crossed my mind is like, hey, I wonder if they got something on Dan, because a lot of people in the media, in the public space, what Deadspin, the way they were bullying people was exposing ESPN executives for sexual malfeasance or sexual harassment. Who knows if it was true or not, but they were just going after people to move the sports media one direction. And Dan could sense it, see it, and he moved that direction. That ended up putting distance between me and Dan. But again, knew his family, just I still had affinity for Dan. And then one day on the show, his partner Stu Gatz, this is probably in 2015 or 16, when I had just moved over to Fox Sports, and I was going to be working with Colin Cowherd. And Stu Gatz sat on that show and told an incredibly dishonest story about me that was totally intended to cause problems between me and Colin Cowherd. Stu Gatz is on air telling some story about how that I had told him personally that I thought Colin Cowherd was a racist, and that Whitlock's being a total hypocrite here because privately he hates Cowherd and thinks Cowherd's a racist. He's telling this story on air. And
Wow.
Dan is there. And so Dan, as a friend of mine, and I know that there had been some distance put between us, but not that kind of, no one, I wouldn't let you right now tell some unbelievable lie about Dan Le Batard that I knew was untrue. And so Dan just sat there quietly and blah, blah. And I'm like, this is the friend of mine. He's letting Stu. This is like, I'm starting a work relationship with Colin Cowherd, and Stu Gatz is on a national radio show saying this kind of stuff. And that's when I was like, oh, me and Dan aren't friends, clearly. Because all he had to do was tell Stu Gatz to shut up. But what they tried to do is like, oh, everybody knows Stu Gatz. Everybody knew that was a lie. Everybody knows that's just Stu Gatz. And I'm like, okay, bro. We're good here. We're done here.
Well, since you're on the Jewcast, and I know that I used to listen to that radio show. I know Stu Gatz's real name, I believe, is John Wiener.
Yeah,
and he's
I would change my name.
Well, yeah. On behalf of the Jews, I'd like to disavow that Wiener. That was a very scummy thing to do. And Dan Le Batard, I have his brother's artwork in my house, Lebo. God rest his soul.